one thing we have to be very careful about, and I'm really bad for this, is just to use the language of we loosely. Because we have to remember that if we just look at the global level, that the top 1% of emitters have carbon footprints collectively that are twice as big as the bottom 50% of the global population. Even within wealthy countries, emissions are highly skewed to the wealthy in those societies. And that wealthy, I think this is something I regularly sort of bang on about, that wealthy includes, of course, the experts, the professors, the academics, the journalists, the barristers, the business leaders, everyone engaged in the climate debate with a few exceptions. Some of the activists perhaps have been some of the exceptions now, not even all of those though, but we are in that 1%. We're in the 10%, where many of us are in that 1%.
Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Fireside Carbon Chat with you, Kevin Anderson, and me as side host here, trying to get the tech up and running. And we're getting like one person joining via the Zoom link that didn't really work, and it didn't work for me either. But yeah, there's like one person dropping in every 3 or 4 minutes, so that's good news. I'll try to get the live stream on YouTube working as well, but I think there's something beyond my tech skills here. There's something bigger going on. But as you said, Kevin, we should get started. We have a lot of questions, and we're here. We managed to get in here, and maybe other people also can join us on Zoom. And if you ask questions on Zoom, you might, if we get the live stream working, end up with your image and your voice if you're asking a question like that. But you can also post your questions in the chat. And if we get this up, or if we're already up, but I don't think so, on YouTube, you can also chat in that chat as well and post your questions. And we have questions also on the Padlet, which is basically where we'll start. Do you want to add something, Kevin, or should we just get going?
No, I think just get going. This is recorded anyway, so if people want
Yeah,
to listen to my various thoughts on things and others as well, then they can,
yeah,
listen to it later.
yeah, that's perfect. So let's just dive into this. And there's no specific, there's an organized chaos to this, but we'll start with a question and see where all of this leads us. So we'll jump back and forth to different topics. So this is a question on BECCS from Paldev Parmar. So, hi, Kevin. Your work is truly inspiring. Thank you for staying true to science. I'm from India and I will be starting my PhD in the UK this September. My project is on the applicability of the BECCS in India. It's my own proposal, so I have flexibility. But the more I read, and based on my experience working at the grassroots in India, it increasingly feels like BECCS is a scam. I just don't see how it could ever scale here meaningfully. I'd really appreciate your honest take on it. Thanks. And maybe you
Mm.
should say what the abbreviation BECCS is
Yes.
as well
So
before we start off.
BECCS is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So the principle behind it is quite simple that through photosynthesis, we grow plant materials, trees, for instance, and as they grow through that process of photosynthesis, they absorb carbon from the atmosphere. You then harvest, if it's trees, you harvest those trees and you combust them in a power station to generate electricity, or indeed you could also just generate heat directly. And then you capture the flue gases, the waste gases that go up the chimney. You strip out the carbon dioxide from those gases and you pump the carbon dioxide deep underground somewhere. And the idea then is that the plants suck the CO2 out of the air, you burn the plants and you bury the CO2. So in theory, at least, you're taking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And it's quite an appealing idea until you start to unpick it a little bit about how much land you require, about the real technical challenges that there are in actual, just in carbon capture and storage, let alone when you're trying to carbon capture and storage the gases that come off from burning different biomass materials. So there are technical challenges and there are land use challenges, which lead into there being issues to do with rights. Who has the rights to the land that's to be used? The quantity required is huge. You can't capture all of the carbon dioxide. And it makes an inefficient process, the process of combustion in the power station, even more inefficient. So I think at every level, it's an inappropriate technology. We're in 2025 and we're looking to return to burning plants. The reason we moved to coal was because plants were not really the appropriate, we had a very low energy density. Then we moved across to oil and gas because coal is quite a low energy density compared to oil and gas. And now we're going to think about going back to plants at a planetary scale. And I think that's a huge mistake on many, many levels. But I say land use, land rights, technology, and distraction. And I think this is the key thing. And I'm I'm slightly reluctant to use the language of scam, but I have used it before. I think it's certainly a distraction from the sorts of changes we need to be making. These BECCS technologies are embedded in all of the major models that look at what we need to do about climate change. And they're not embedded in some small level. We assume in virtually every single model that in the future, we will apply BECCS at such a level that it will remove hundreds of billions of tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And the reason we assume that in the models, because that means we can delay action from today and pass it on to the future. And that delay means we can maintain the political framework we have today. We can maintain business as usual. We can maintain the obsession with economic growth. All of the things that we have normalized, those ephemeral short-term economics that we've completely normalized in our society and dare not question, that is allowed to exist because we are now relying on technologies, particularly BECCS, for the future to be deployed by our children to suck our carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So I think in many respects, BECCS is a scam. It's a delay technique rather than a technology. Now, I'm sure that we pumped enough money into it, we could make the technology work, but not at scale in any meaningful fashion. So I think it is a huge distraction from the sorts of changes we require in lifestyles and indeed in other technologies. So I'd see it's BECCS and the idea of BECCS as being part of the problem, not part of the solution.
And if you think about if you would start a PhD now, if you think of yourself as a younger man, what would you focus on if you had that flexibility?
If you had to focus on BECCS, well, I think again, I mean, you have to come to that conclusion I've come to myself through doing the analysis. You've got to think about it yourself, do the reading, think about particularly the scale of issues. A lot of I'm trying to be quite polite about this. A lot of time when scientists come up with ideas, and when I say scientists, I often also mean academic engineers who have never worked outside of academia. What they're often very poor at doing is thinking about scaling something up. So going from a small pilot scheme or the idea of a professor in a laboratory to hundreds of billions of tons of carbon capture and storage and with biomass and energy, I think that scaling up is just, it is not just a matter of let's multiply what the science tells us. It embeds in it deep engineering challenges and social and ecological challenges. There are huge ecological issues about using bioenergy from a monocrop perspective, as well as all the other things that are there, and the damage it may do to soils as well. So I would say be very, very cautious about governments or institutions that are pushing BECCS as a key plank of trying to respond to our Paris and other commitments, and try to analyze and unpick the numbers at a scale level and say, does it match? Does what we know match the commitments that the governments have signed up to?
Yeah.
Thinking about through those sets of issues. You can't just think of through technology. It's technology, it's land rights, it's ecological challenges, all of that sort of. You have to take quite a holistic approach to BECCS. As other technologies like DACS, which is direct air capture, and that comes with other problems, direct air carbon capture and storage. That comes with other problems, but they're quite different to the ones that are in BECCS. BECCS really embeds many of the problems that we are facing on climate change in one particular technology, or I would call it a pseudo technology, because it doesn't really exist at scale, and I don't think it can exist at scale.
Yeah. Before I let you in, Killian, as well with a follow-up or the next question, I can just confirm that there is a Zoom outage kind of problem. That's not us. So we picked the perfect time for this. We kind of pinpointed the high point of the Zoom
Okay.
outage. So we'll see if we can go live. But the people that are here is enough for a long conversation. So Killian, go ahead. And is it okay if I share you on screen, your video as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not shy. Not
No,
much to look at, but not shy.
no, but there we go.
All right, so I made some comments in the chat, so I won't repeat all that. But in addition to that, in terms of the scale thing, I've had conversations with Simon Michaud, did some interviews with him and with Steve Keen, and the numbers for the scaling of these things economically and in terms of how long they take to do. For example, I noted that you'd need like 30,000 of any whatever kind of capture you're going to use. You'd need like 30,000 plants like that, and there's just no way that fits the risk
Mm.
time scale. It just doesn't fit. And then in terms of resources, that's another thing we never talk about. if you take all the things that people want to do on the tech side, and this is one of them, and you scale them up so that everybody gets it, everyone gets the benefit, and we solve the problem, you run out of resources, so many different resources, by the end of this century or close to it. There's just so many issues connected to all this. And you're right, Kevin, we don't have these conversations where all these pieces are talked about so people really understand the full thing. They just hear, oh, BECCS is kind of good or it's not kind of good, but they don't get the full picture of the risk, the timelines, the lack of resources, the costs, and how it doing any of this keeps us embedded also in the in capitalism, which now more and more and more people are saying, just capitalism itself just isn't going to work, right? And that's a whole different conversation, but it's something that has to be part of the conversation, and we're not having holistic conversations about these things. Thank you.
I just add on CCS. I think it's worth bearing in mind. So bioenergy with CCS almost assumes that carbon capture and storage is something we have and works at scale. It doesn't. We probably capture the global level now, capture and store. Remember, the storing is important. We capture some carbon dioxide, and the majority of the carbon dioxide we capture from energy plants is then used to produce more oil through a process called enhanced oil recovery. So you use the carbon dioxide to pump out more oil. So I don't call that carbon capture and storage. It's a process for producing more oil. If you look at carbon capture and storage, we probably at a global level store somewhere around about 10 million tons of carbon dioxide globally, 10 million tons. Remember, we emit from fossil fuels about 38 billion tons of carbon dioxide, 38 billion tons. And we've been talking about carbon capture and storage for at least 2 decades. I've got colleagues who've been working on it for at least 2 decades. And we are now only storing 10 million tons globally. And I think that demonstrates the skill of talking about BECCS and CCS is not about the technology. It is about the process by which we can delay legislation to curtail the use of fossil fuels. That is the key purpose of carbon capture and storage when used on energy and of BECCS. It is not the technology. Now, that's not to say there aren't some very good engineers and scientists working on these things and often being paid for by the oil and gas companies, not always, but sometimes. But remember, getting people to work on these things is very cheap. And it's much cheaper to pay people to work on these than it is to put in place the legislation that actually curtails our use of fossil fuels. So I think we have to be very careful to ensure that we don't fall into the trap. Just because we see a few university departments and a few pilot schemes working on something means that that is a viable way to respond to the challenges. Often these things are there to delay legislation. I can highly recommend the book by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, Merchant of Doubt, which really captures this idea of established incumbent industries deliberately delaying legislation by these sorts of techniques.
Okay, thank you. We'll take another question from the Padlet. Let me just hang on here. I'll add myself. So we'll connect to another topic here that we also talked about before, risk-based communication. I have begged the scientific community for nearly 20 years to focus messaging on the long trail existential threat of climate change, risk over discussing most probable outcomes. Why hasn't this shift occurred, as it would be far more effective? And that was from Anonymous.
Yeah, well, I think that is, again, risk, a really important issue. But I think, actually, they asked the question, why hasn't it occurred? And I think it hasn't occurred because if you take a risk-based approach, and it's not just risk, it's risk and consequences. So you could have a high risk, but if the consequences were pretty small, then you wouldn't worry so much. If you have a high risk and the consequences are dire, then you really need to be doing something rapidly to change your ways of doing something. But at the moment, what we have is not insignificant risks of absolutely dire consequences. And our governments still are choosing to do almost nothing about that. The problem is if you want to respond on a risk basis, it will ask fundamental questions about today's norms. And I think this may be something we repeat over and over in these discussions tonight, that most of the things that we are choosing to do or to talk about are ways that we can maintain business as usual. They're not ways about how you respond to our climate commitments as laid out, for instance, in the Paris Agreement or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. What the approaches are about is how can we tweak business as usual? How can we green growth? How can we maintain the status quo? And therefore, we will find any technique we can, whether that's a technology or pseudo-technology promise for the future, whether it's to move away from something like a risk-based approach to something when we just talk about averages. All of these things are there in significant part, not completely, in significant part, to avoid asking the deeply challenging political questions that we need to ask if we're to respond to the climate commitments that our governments have signed up to. And what I find disturbing in this is that deeply co-opted in this is the expert community. We are part of the problem, is that we are unprepared to say what our analysis tells us, and particularly then through the lens of risk. Because if we do that, it makes us unpopular. It means that the conclusions that we draw are not ones that can be aligned with business as usual. They cannot be aligned with green growth. They can't be aligned with a technology tomorrow to allow us to carry on expanding roads, airports, consumption. And so they ask, when you go risk-based approach on this, it asks these fundamental questions about the norms that we have. And we are yet unprepared, certainly the senior people who head our companies, our governments, our institutions, and indeed much of the expert class as well. We are unprepared to have those questions asked as yet.
All right. Are there any questions here in this very exclusive Zoom that we have? This seems like there's been a stop now, and I think it might be a European thing as well. So anybody want to jump in here? Otherwise, we'll just go back to the Padlet. Yeah, you can. Yeah, Jennifer, you have your hand raised, your non-digital hand. Please go ahead. Do you want your video added as well, or just your voice?
Sure, that's okay.
Yeah, I'll just add you.
Thanks. I just put the question in the thing, but yeah, I just want to thank you, Dr. Anderson. I'm in Canada, and I heard you testify at the parliamentary committee a few years ago about having to phase down the oil sands, which I'm so grateful for. I'm not sure which party got you there, but we are in the middle of a federal election right now, and we have no party that's leading on climate. And so I just don't know whether I should keep voting for the kind of lefty party that's decided climate doesn't poll well, so they're not doing much, or support Mark Carney and the liberal kind of surge that's happening at the moment and try and push the party from within. Like there's a big debate tonight. Not sure climate's on there, but all it seems to be is about more pipelines. So here in Canada, we have so much captured politicians, captured media. We just can't get the phase down on the agenda at all. And yeah, so in the question I have is like, I used to be a teacher. So it's like, wasn't part of the Paris commitment to get climate curriculum in schools? So is that not a way to, if you know how kids got their parents to stop smoking when they learn the connection there? If we get this in the schools, the science, media literacy, and the solutions, we could kind of start moving towards the discourse and solutions that we need the fastest. I don't know which pathway to. Lots of questions there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the two things. First, on the schools, a colleague and I have engaged quite a lot with something called the Global Action Plan. There's a man called Morgan Phillips who works within them, and they do a lot of work, I think mostly in the UK, but possibly elsewhere as well, looking at how you get climate change onto the curriculum. How do you embed it in? And even if you can't get it on the curriculum, how can you use the existing curriculum to talk about these issues? But again, not talk about them in a simple siloed way.
Yes,
and that's one of the big problems that climate change, and indeed many of these huge challenges that we face, are not ones you can address through siloed mentalities. Often that makes them worse, I think. But having said that, much though I think that's very important, I also think we'd be very cautious about at least appearing to pass the burden on to the next generation, just because we have chosen not to do this. It's not as if we're not short of education here. We're not short of knowledge or understanding. What we're short of is courage, I think, a lot of the time, to stand up. We know what needs to be done. So on that side, I think, yes, on education, but I think we mustn't in any way pass the burden on to the next generation. We are doing that anyway, through our inaction, and we have done that through our ongoing inaction for a third of a century or so now. The other thing I think about I can't suggest what you should do in Canada. I don't know Canadian politics particularly well, but I have some understanding of Mark Carney's position on climate change. He was the head of the Bank of England for a long time, paid I think about £800,000 a year, and so he normalised a way of living that is completely and utterly incompatible with any ecological challenge, let alone climate change. He was then appointed, I can't remember the exact details, by a previous prime minister of ours who remained nameless. He was appointed, as if you like, a sort of like climate change guru.
Yes.
And his focus was principally on carbon trading, offsetting carbon trading, all the financialization of carbon, the financialization of nature, and then you can let markets deal with the levels of change that are necessary through a price mechanism. I think that fundamentally misunderstands the challenges that we face on numerous levels. I think we have to be very, very cautious about simply thinking we can trade our way out of this. We have left it so late from a carbon budget perspective, in other words, the total amount of emissions we can put in the atmosphere, to stay within even the weaker 2 degrees C interpretation of the Paris Agreement. The rates of change for every country globally, every sector, will be far beyond them being able to say, we'll help you in another part of the world. And it's always interesting that the Mark Carneys of this world and the people that support that approach, they're almost always based in rich countries. And it's how can they use carbon trading with either poorer people, poorer communities, poorer industries, or poorer countries to get them to compensate for the norms of wealthy high emitters, of very wealthy high emitting countries. So it's passing the burden down to people who really struggle as it is to deal with climate change. And I think really, again, it misunderstands how rapidly we need to move away from fossil fuels. And we need to do that ourselves rather than pass that burden on to others. So how you should vote in Canada, I really don't know. I mean, you might argue Mark Carney is a breath of fresh air. In some respects, perhaps that depends on your politics. But from a climate point of view, I think he is part of the problem. I'd almost go further. I think the Mark Carney approach to climate change, and I did the approach of many market economists on this, and those that are embedded in what I call the integrated assessment models. I see that approach as being, if you like, the new Exxon. They're the new technique for delaying the sorts of rapid, radical changes that we require. Now, they might be well-meaning people, but I think that they have willfully misunderstood the challenges that we face. And so they can perpetuate business as usual through, in Mark's case, the process of carbon trading. And in other people, BECCS or offsetting or passing the burden on to the future. It's always about to someone else or across time. It's never about what can we do today to deliver on our commitments.
Yep, we'll take another question from the Padlet. This is a question from Mark Bannister, focused on the UK. So does saving British steel mean the end of net zero 2050 in the UK? And there's a longer explanation around this, but I guess you know the news.
Yes, we do know there's news.
Yeah.
Yes. I would start off by saying I think net zero 2050 is part of the problem. I think it's, again, it was being used as a framework to maintain business as usual. You know, net zero 2050 allows us to expand airports, expand roads, to have more gas fields, to get more gas-fired power stations, to increase, sales of cars, to delay action on many of the other things that we need to be doing. So net zero 2050 is not there as an adequate response for a wealthy country to deliver on our Paris commitments. It is there to allow, again, business as usual or greened business as usual in our current political system. It's been phenomenally effective because almost across the board, whether you're an expert or a journalist, we cannot say the word zero without the word net in front of it. So that normalization of what is effectively a scam, it is almost complete now. So in the UK, we focus on net zero 2050. And certainly it would appear that we will require some steel. And of course, most steel is required by poorer countries who are rapidly building their infrastructure, an infrastructure we already have in the wealthy countries of the world. But nevertheless, we will require some steel. And I'm not sure, I would always say it's appropriate to import that from elsewhere. If we can find ways to produce very low carbon steel, and that might mean a lot of other additional technologies, the Swedes are looking at using hydrogen and so forth. So if we can find that, and if we can make those technologies available to other countries, particularly countries that are rapidly industrializing, without a cost to it. So here's the technology. This is what you have to do if you want to have low carbon steel. Then that is a good thing. But the other part we have to remember this is how do we reduce the quantity of these materials that we consume? It's not just about let's find a way to make something like a material or a commodity green, but principally what we have to do is reduce the use of them. So if I want to go down the shops, what's the typical approach that we use? We jump in a car that weighs 1 to 3 tons, most of that metal, to drive to the shops to pick up, a few kilograms of cabbage, cauliflower, groceries, and whatever it might be. Then we drive home again. That isn't a good use of steel. Getting on an electric bike that weighs 11 to 15 kilograms and cycling to the supermarket or walking there and coming back is a good use of materials. So it's not just about the materials themselves, it's about the use of them. How do we use these materials appropriately? And that brings us back actually to demand side issues. That when we look at something like steel, the key response for all of these things first is, what do we do about demand? And you try to address the demand issue first, and then you move up that to the supply issue, because the supply issue always takes longer to resolve. If you don't use a ton of steel, then you haven't emitted from using steel. And that's what we need to be thinking about, not just with steel, but with other commodities as well. And that's, I think, another issue that we haven't really addressed, because it does beg again questions of our norms of ongoing growth, of the view that we always will consume more tomorrow, that our children will have bigger and better houses and bigger, faster transport and more flights and more car, all of these things that we assume will just keep growing almost infinitely in our society. And that makes us focus typically on the supply side. But we need to turn that around and address the demand issue. But at the moment, it's just really lip service is applied to the demand issue. So there's a lot in the question about net zero and steel in the UK that really needs to be unpicked.
All right. So back to the Zoom. Killian, you have another question. I'll just put you on here. Hang on. All right, there you go.
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce this. If we don't ever have a serious discussion about what that means when we say use less, when we talk about it the way that you just did, and this isn't even a critique or criticism, it's just an observation. It doesn't bring home so much the idea that we have to change how we live on this planet. The vast majority of us do. And so the big problem that we have, in my opinion, is we're talking about this and how can we simply reduce how much technology we use? Let's keep using it, but let's just reduce. Well, how? How do you do that? Right? There's no way to do that without massively reducing consumption. And so what does that mean? And if you just talk about it in those terms and talk about it in terms of economics, blah, 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 it kind of just causes people to think in terms of, well, you're going to take stuff away from me. I don't want to live without my cars and my phones, blah, blah, blah. But if we twist that around and say, well, what can the planet do? What can the planet give us? What is a regenerative system? What does a regenerative human nature hybrid system look like? And then problem solve from there. Now we're getting somewhere, but that's not what we do. We always talk about it in ways that say, well, let's just try to do what we do less. But none of what we do is sustainable in any way, shape, or form. I mean, like 99% of what humans do is absolutely unsustainable. And that gives us a sense of the scale of change we need. And I think a simple way to approach that is to say, look, let's turn this around. Let's start with, what is a regenerative community? What does that look like? And then problem solve how to get there, rather than how to preserve what we have in, using, just by trying to use less.
Yeah, the bit I would add to that, I mean, I don't really disagree with any of that. I think that's, I mean, as an engineering perspective, I quite think it was a sort of an entropy issue. But I think one thing we have to be very careful about, and I'm really bad for this, is just to use the language of we loosely. Because we have to remember that if we just look at the global level, that the top 1% of emitters have carbon footprints collectively that are twice as big as the bottom 50% of the global population. Even within wealthy countries, emissions are highly skewed to the wealthy in those societies. And that wealthy, I think this is something I regularly sort of bang on about, that wealthy includes, of course, the experts, the professors, the academics, the journalists, the barristers, the business leaders, everyone engaged in the climate debate, with a few exceptions. Some of the activists perhaps have been some of the exceptions now, not even all of those though, but we are in that 1%. We're in the 10%, where many of us are in that 1%. And so we never talk about this absolutely core issue to me of inequality within our societies. So I won't talk about some of the rapidly industrializing countries or some of the less developed countries, because culturally, I think I have to be very careful with. We often talk about those parts of the world. We've engaged in those parts of the world from the rich countries for decades, if not centuries, in a really misguided way. So I will focus my comments on wealthy countries like the UK, much of continental Europe, the US, and so forth. And there I see we can separate out the emissions between what I've called discretionary emissions and structural emissions. So many people in the UK are in fuel poverty. They're locked in, and probably somewhere 10 to 15% of households. They're locked into poor quality houses, often that they rent. They can't afford to be putting solar panels on their roof. They can't afford to insulate their homes. They might drive a poor quality car to work because there's not good public transport nearby. They can't afford an electric vehicle. And so for these people, they're structurally locked into the physical environment they're in, and it's very hard for them to reduce their emissions directly. But of course, most emissions are discretionary. It's not that community. Most emissions are those of us who are maybe we're nice and clean, we recycle our glass and so forth, but actually we are often the high emitters. We fly regularly, we live in large houses, some people have 2 homes, we have a nice new car every few years, maybe a big car, maybe we have 2 cars. We have embedded a whole set of norms that are absolutely discretionary. We don't have to live like that. We choose to live like that. Our friends are like that. Often our families are like that. Our work colleagues. So we've completely normalized a totally abnormal way of living. And those emissions are discretionary. So when we talk about the we, I think we have to be very careful between these 2 groups. And it's the discretionary emissions that you could actually, if politicians and society felt it was appropriate or had the courage to do this, it's the discretionary emissions that you can rapidly change literally within weeks to a few years. As the structural emissions, the quality of the houses, for instance, takes longer to do. So I think when we talk about doing less, I don't want to see poor people in the world doing less. In some respects, I want some poor communities in the world to be burning more fossil fuels in the near term, because that means that will improve their quality of life to some degree. Hopefully, they can rapidly shift across away from fossil fuels. But that means within a set carbon budget that the wealthy of us have to reduce our emissions even faster. And so if we live within a budget, we are really constrained by that within our countries and at a global level. But that equity debate is simply not had, because virtually everyone engaged in the climate debate is in that, not everyone, but certainly the expert and the institutional and the business and the policy realm and the journalist realm, we're almost all in that 1%. And so it's not a debate we feel comfortable having, because it will affect how we see the world. And that's the last thing that we want to do.
Yeah, I don't want to talk overly long so things get truncated. And I agree with everything you just said. And I frame it myself to people that if you're in the 1%, you're going to have to cut probably 99%. If you're in the top 10%, you're going to be cutting at least 90, if not 95, et cetera. And it just goes on down the line. And there are people, as you said, that don't have to, cut anything. And if they choose to, could increase, if they don't if they want to change their lifestyle, whatever, they could increase it somewhat. But another thing is those people that are at the very low end, they're actually the ones that can shift into regenerative lifestyles the fastest. And they could not only be not consuming and avoiding consuming a bunch of stuff that we do that they don't need to, but they could, their footprint could be so negative just by doing regenerative farming, just by changing how they grow food, that they become deeply negative, and we're riding on their emissions cuts, so yeah, everything you said is absolutely correct, and we do need to think about that. And yeah, there's a few billion people that don't need to be cutting anything.
Yeah, I think that's the point. I think for many of the poor societies, they can leapfrog the mistakes that we've made, and that will often need perhaps some financial assistance from some of the wealthier countries. And of course, we're bought into that right from the UNFCCC being signed in 1992, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, right through every single major international negotiation every year, these conference of the parties like Paris, like Glasgow. So these big events, we sign up every year that we will help the poor parts of the world financially to make the adjustments that are necessary. But I also think with our own countries, I quite like that language. I think it might have come from Monbiot originally, but it's the language I've been using for a while now. We need to aim for a society of private sufficiency and public luxury, so that we can live adequate lives privately, but publicly, our swimming pools will be good quality and open. Our libraries will be there. The parks will be there. The public transport will be there. So if you like, that's a public luxury. So we put our resources not into private wealth, which is an obsession in the UK. Private wealth for relatively few, of course. So we still talk about cost of living crisis. I see there is no cost of living crisis in the UK. There is an equality crisis. We're the 10th richest country in the world, and our population is only 0.84% of the world population. So we're incredibly wealthy, somewhere like the UK. And yet we've normalized, like with net zero, we've normalized the language of a cost of living crisis. We're not short of income every year. We're not short of wealth. We have plenty of both of those. What we've decided to do is to allocate those to a small, relatively small group of people. We could, of course, have a wonderful public infrastructure. Instead, we've got squalid public infrastructure in the UK, and that's increasingly true for many other industrialized countries, where we're privatizing wealth and resources and indeed labor, rather than putting it into the public good, if you like. So that I like that framing of a society being something where it's private sufficiency and public luxury, and I think we could align that with the sort of ecological boundaries that we have to live within. Though that gets harder and harder the more we normalize certain types of consumption.
Well, my only caution on that framing would be that there's got to be a framing before that, which is what you got to at the end is, again, if we're not starting from what is actually sustainable, if we're not starting from what is regenerative, and then making our decisions based on that, and that would determine what the level of consumption must be and what the level of public good can be. And of course, if you've ever heard me talk before, I always talk about, we have to go to a commons-based society, period. There's no way around that. I don't see any way around that. I've done the math a billion times and everything. I've looked at social systems and economic systems. There is absolutely no way to maintain the economic system we have now and do this stuff that we're doing in the long run.
Yeah.
So yeah, if we're gonna say, that's what a commons would do. You have your stuff in your house, whatever, but it's based on the total that the community can consume, and you share large scale resources. You share, food supply. You share, farming land. It's the forest. You share all that stuff. And so, in that sense, I agree with you. I'm not comfortable with putting it in terms of, having this group abundance or group wealth. That makes me very uncomfortable because we skip right over what's regenerative and what's sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We should switch to another question on the Padlet. Thank you there, Kalyan. So this is from the user Activist Scientist. And it's a bit long, but I'll shorten it down. So as part of the established scientific community yourself, what are your views on the structural barriers that researchers from marginalized communities from climate vulnerable regions face in global north academic institutions when they challenge the artificial divide between science and activism? That was a bit of a long sentence. Should I read it again?
Yeah, go on, just once more, because I got
Yeah. As part of the established scientific community yourself, what are your views on the structural barriers that researchers from marginalized communities from climate vulnerable regions face in global north academic institutions when they challenge the artificial divide between science and activism?
Right. Well, if I've understood that correctly, that is a huge question. In my view, we still have I'm trying to think what the appropriate language we should use here. It doesn't sound like there's a polite form of racism, I think, that still goes on. Sometimes less polite, but generally a polite form of racism that still separates, if you like, global north institutions from scholars in the global south, not just scholars, but other people as well in the global south. And I don't just mean this between some sort of right-wing bigots. I mean, many of us who like to see ourselves as progressive liberals, I think, have this embedded in our behaviors and in our institutions. And it's challenging for me to say that because I think I am one of them. And I think we sometimes have to stop and reflect on something that is very difficult and challenging to us. I'm already starting to feel uncomfortable saying this, but I think it is important to say it. I don't think I've said it before anywhere publicly. If I see a paper with a name that I find difficult to pronounce, I observe myself already downgrading the quality of the work that may be in that paper before I've read a word. That's because I'm the product of an institution, a country that has embedded that depth of racism, even those of us who like to see ourselves as progressives. And so I think until we can recognize that and be genuinely open to the voices of the global south, in fact, in this particular case, I think on climate change and many other issues, we need to be more than open. We need to almost like positively discriminate towards them, because they are the ones that are living through the repercussions of what we have knowingly done, at least for the last 30 years, if not considerably longer. So yeah, I think there are huge barriers to scholars from marginalized communities from the global south, whatever the appropriate language is to use. I'm not really that certain. I mean, the global majority. There are huge challenges for them to engage in the scientific realm. And I think, as I understand, and I could be wrong on this, maybe someone could put this in the chat, I think there is some evidence to suggest when scholars with names that are not, if you like, Western sounding names have submitted papers, it's harder for them to get published than others. I think people have tested this out. So, and I could be wrong about that, but maybe it's anecdotal stories I've heard. But certainly, that is a narrative that I've heard a number of times. So I think there are big issues, but there are also issues I think about that to do with age in this, seniority, and something I go on about a lot is that typically people who are not well established in their field are more open-minded than those of us, in my particular case, old, grey-haired, white men who think we know how to solve the problems, but actually we have lost that capacity to be innovative. We may have had it when we were 20 or 25 or 30 or 35. As we get older, and I'm very reluctant to accept this again, but I have to see it's absolutely the case in me as well. As we get older, we get more and more locked into the baggage of the norms around us and those that we've worked within. And so when someone comes in from the outside, comes left field, we almost dismiss it. So I think there's also an element here that we are trying to solve problems now that people like me have failed to resolve. People of my generation, experts like me, have failed to resolve. And that means I think we have to open our doors to people who think differently. Now, that doesn't mean say we haven't got something to offer. Clearly, we still, well, hopefully we still have. But we haven't managed to resolve these issues, either technically or politically or socially or culturally. And so I think we have to be open-minded about this and say, let's bring in voices from elsewhere, almost voices that we've been reluctant to accept into the debate before. And that can be global south scholars, it can be activists, it can be younger early career researchers. It's people from outside, I suppose, the normal, the powers that be, the usual suspects that engage on these issues. We need to go beyond that realm. So I think there are huge challenges, both from a cultural point of view, people in the global south, but also from an age point of view. And I'm pretty confident that still extends to a gender perspective as well. And so we have to open that debate. We have to be prepared to open up that debate to voices we would normally try to quieten down or to marginalize. And that will mean questioning our institutions, our publication organizations, the ones that publish the papers. We'll have to start to unpick these and say, we need to find a mechanism by letting these other voices be heard.
All right.
Uncomfortable for me to talk about, I have to say that. It was not easy.
Yeah. Also for me, I mean, everybody's getting older, so it's you realize this with time. Maybe that's part of the wisdom you can't break out. I'm going to add a question here on the end because it was just recent in Swedish news and probably in European and world news as well, around the European State of the Climate Report for 2024 and how this was framed in Swedish news media, which might be, because we can't really get into the details of the report, is that they framed the whole thing, and it's probably correct because they've done a whole report on it, but they framed it as the European continent being the one hardest hit or most affected by climate change. And I don't know if they only looked at temperatures or not, but that was how the whole news and how the report was framed in Swedish news media. So do you have any comment on that? Because it kind of seems to go against some of the things you come back to in your lectures and in these conversations.
Yeah, well, like my understanding is in that report, and I've only glanced at it and heard other people commenting on it, is that the warming in Europe is about twice the global average, and there are two key reasons for that. Other people can comment whether I'm misunderstanding this, but one of them is our geographical location. And the second is that we're nearer a pole, we're near the North Pole, and that's an area that warms faster. And the second one is that we're cleaning the air up, not the carbon dioxide. We're cleaning the air up by having standards on burning of fuels and so forth. And that reduces the amount of aerosols that is put into the atmosphere in Europe. And the aerosol issue is typically a sort of regional rather than a global issue, because aerosols tend to fall out the atmosphere quite relatively quickly. And so as we clean the air up and we move the aerosols, then those aerosols were reflecting some sunlight, some warming back out into the atmosphere. And as you take those away, that warming that was masked before by these polluting aerosols is now evident. We can now measure that. And so a mixture of those two, geography and cleaning up, removing the aerosols by cleaning up our fossil fuels. These are two reasons why we're seeing, I think, about twice the average level of warming in Europe. Now, it's one of those few occasions where perhaps it's nice to see the impacts being felt by those people that are causing the most of the problems. I'd much rather that double the warming occur here than it would do in the poor part of the community, poor part of the world. But I mean, even so, we of course have the wherewithal. We've already built a lot of infrastructure to deal with a lot more of these issues in the short to medium term. So in the short to medium term, we can probably deal with quite a lot of the climate impacts that we're going to be facing here, at a collective level, certainly. But of course, many other parts of the world are not in that position to do that. But I think it's also interesting playing out to understand that Europe still struggles. I mean, Europe struggles in many respects with the current climate, let alone the fact that we're heading towards a new normal. And that new normal will not be a normal, because that will go to the next one, because there's no sense of us at the moment eliminating emissions. And we have to bear in mind that the temperature only stops going up when we eliminate emissions, not when we reduce them. I think a lot of people think as you reduce emissions, you should see temperatures coming down. As we reduce emissions, temperatures go up. And at the moment, in fact, it does look like there's a recent report showing how the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has gone up much faster than we thought. And it's probably at the moment thinking it might be a land sink issue, that the land is no longer absorbing as much CO2 as it was before. And it's not a small adjustment, as we sometimes see in science, that we then have to discuss. It's a big shift. So this is really very worrying. Let's hope there's some other reason for it, but this is very concerning. And so we're not moving towards a new normal. We're moving through a new normal and then through another one until we eliminate the use of emissions. And so Europe at the moment, I think it's probably sitting on its laurels and thinks it can deal with what happened in Valencia. I mean, that was a disaster for people living in Valencia. But for Spain as a whole, it's got a very rapidly growing economy, much faster than many other European countries. It can actually deal with the wherewithal of that financially, at least in the immediate term. As we see more warming, those impacts will get larger and larger, more and more global. In a globalized world, that affect food security. It'll affect migration. That means there'll be more military tension. You can see all of those things that build up as we continue to see climate change exacerbating existing tensions and then starting to cause tensions itself. So, Europe is seeing more rapid warming in other parts of the world. It has the ability to deal with that in the short term, but it doesn't in the medium to long term. And I think probably in all of this, the lessons are that we are in a globalized community, and thinking about how we solve these problems in isolation, in our own home, in our own country, in our own city, that's important, but we have to see it in a global context. If we don't see it in a global context, we lock in the problems for ourselves and, of course, other people in the world, as well as, of course, our own children. So I think we need to have a much better sort of understanding of our actions within the global world. So it's that old act local, think global. Is that right? Yeah. So we need to do what we can do locally, but think about the context globally. That's really important. And thus far, the wealthy parts of the world have not done that. And I would say the mindset at the moment, triggered partly by the politics in the US, is one about looking after yourself, not worrying about others. Yeah. Perhaps the motto should be, make the world great again.
That's a great ending to all of this. And that's the end of our hour. So, and thanks to the people that managed to join us on Zoom and kept trying the link. I don't know if there's anybody else. I mean, we were happy to start early, so otherwise I don't think we would have gotten in anyway. So we got in early and we managed to stay here. So and thanks everybody submitting questions also on Padlet. and we'll probably do this again later this year, and maybe not have the exact timing of managing to find a Zoom outage point in the evening as well. So thanks everybody on Zoom, and thanks
Thank
for your
you.
questions, and thanks for this evening.